Good morning, gentlemen, and haven't we been living through very strange times? Everything closed, shops, museums, the only travelling possible in the early days of lockdown, as the ticket on the top right shows, was from living room to garden by way of the kitchen. Strange days indeed, and strange sights we saw. Empty shelves, a run on toilet paper, if you excuse the expression. Homeschooling, face masks. Weird beings inhabited our television. Did anyone else spot the similarity between Matt Hancock and Lieutenant Gruber from Allo, Allo? So as I sat at home, worrying about my daughter and son-in-law working in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, a few things kept me going. There were, of course, Trump's antics and utterances, strangely fascinating. Often I felt completely, surreally sociopathic. There were the various newspaper scandals that kept me interested, both to annoy and to amuse me. We conducted family meetings and church services and, of course, Probus meetings on Zoom. It was while watching one of those when it clicked what Zooming actually reminded me of. Do you remember this bit from the Muppet Show that appeared regularly? My other salvation was I bought an electric bike and was now able to venture abroad. I obeyed Nurse Nicola, of course, not too far, but enough to get me out of house and garden when I had weeded and painted everything in sight. I decided I'd venture further afield and visit places about which I knew nothing. Can you tell where I am here, in the midst of this apocalyptic landscape? Very appropriate, I thought, for the real-life disaster movie which I felt I was living through. It is, of course, the site of the old manual brickworks, alias Steens, a business which opened in the year 1928. The site is now totally cleared and lies derelict, with huge piles of fire bricks scattered across the 122-acre site. However, it was once a massive concern, employing 1,200 workers, many of whom lived in the village of White Cross, which grew up to accommodate the workforce in the 1930s. Most of the workers laboured in that same factory for 20 or 30 years, helping a business concern which exported its wares to 120 countries in the world, at its peak producing 100,000 tonnes of brick a year and winning the Queen's Award for Industry. The business wound up in 2001. Sorry, I've lost my script. And plans, of course, were made to create a vast housing estate on the site, but nothing has happened. It stands empty and forlorn. But, and this is what I had really come to see, tucked away in one corner, incredibly, are the remains of a medieval fortress. It's called Haining or Ammon Castle, is now completely derelict, not to say dangerous. Its condition and isolated location giving no clue as to its interesting past. The original building was constructed in the 15th century for William Crawford of Manuel, when the head of this wealthy landowning family was granted the lands of Haining by King James I. Their mansion was duly entitled Haining Castle. Through marriage, the castle came into the hands of the powerful Livingston family, and they extended and beautified the building, placing a date lintel above the new entrance. That lintel is now incorporated above the entrance to an old barn at the nearby Gill Meadowland farm, and indeed much of the stonework of the castle has been similarly purloined. It was really eerie standing there alone, looking at the dilapidated ruin, alive only with jackdaws, and trying to visualize the one-time inhabitants who lived there and dined in splendour in the great banqueting hall on the top floor. There was Alexander Livingston, guardian of the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. There was Sir James Livingston, who received his knighthood from King James VI, along with the title Lord Ammon, and from then on the building was known as Ammon Castle. Sir James was not often in residence in Ammon Castle, as he was a commander of the Scots Dutch Brigade, and often abroad, helping the Protestants in the Netherlands to achieve independence from Spanish Habsburg rule. But when he was at home, what intrigue surrounded him. At one of his dinner parties, a plot was hatched to kidnap the Marquis of Argyll and the Marquis of Hamilton, two gentlemen who opposed Livingston's view of the Covenanting movement. However, before the plan could be carried out, someone tipped off the targeted aristocrats, and they fled to Kinneil House, Hamilton's property in Bowness. Barricaded in, they were safe from attack, protected by the Marquis's private army, the Bonician Brigade. Now there's a terrifying concept. Ammon Castle remained in Livingston hands until the family decided to support the losing side in the 1715 Jacobite rebellion. As a punishment, they lost all their land and their titles, including Ammon Castle, which was handed over to the Forfeited Estates Commission. The administrators stripped the building of all its movable fabric and left the edifice to slowly decay into the state from which I now sadly departed. The next week, my cycling took me in roughly the same direction, but a bit further. Down to the River Avon at Muiravinside Country Park, where there are some great bicycle trails through the woods. Following one of them, I eventually arrived at the foundations of the mansion that once was the hub of the vast estate, a building purchased by Falkirk Planning Department in 1978. The officials found it in a bad state of repair and decided to demolish it the next year, amidst, it has to be said, much opposition, for the historic edifice had a fascinating story to tell. Dating back to the 15th century, through marriage, the estate was incorporated into the Barony of Ross in 1556, the same family which owned the Linlithgow townhouse and the rear garden ducat, which still stands at the canal basin. The Ross armorial bearings, you can see, show 3 water bougies, that is, goatskins carried in a yoke, for the Rosses were the hereditary water bearers to the monarchy. The Ross family lived in Muiravinside until 1669. Thereafter, over the centuries, a variety of families acquired the property. Dyells, until the head of the family, Lieutenant Colonel John, was killed at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. Then there were a succession of MacLeods, including Alexander, Bonnie Prince Charlie's principal aide-de-camp, who fled the Culloden battlefield with his prince. And there was another Alexander, a lawyer who operated for a time in Jamaica, handling the products of the appalling African slave trade. Incidentally, the first mentioned Alexander MacLeod, the Jacobite one, fled from Culloden along with Dr. Archibald Cameron, brother of clan chief Cameron of Lochiel. MacLeod managed to flee to France, but Cameron was captured, brought to Linlithgow in chains, and imprisoned in the toll booth below the borough halls. He was then taken to London, as the picture shows, dragged through the streets on a sledge, before being hanged, cut down alive, and beheaded at Tyburn, the last Jacobite to be executed. Eventually, back to Muiravinside, the Stirling family acquired the residence. Thomas and Mabel are shown in the lower pictures, in one of them with their son Arthur. Above are 4 of the 12 staff who were employed by them, and by this date, the original dwelling had been considerably added to. Several hired hands were needed to look after the 19 bedrooms, the laundry room, the kitchen, the coach house, and the gardens. The Stirlings were generous landowners, and every year entertained the children of Muiravinside Sunday School, who travelled to the mansion by packed canal barges, where, John, is the Scottish Canal's health and safety certificates here.
Your house out MCA.
The courtyard collection of farm buildings still stand. Cart sheds, storehouses, a coach house, stables, a small brewery, and various service buildings. The First World War severely affected the Stirlings. A son, Lieutenant Robert, was killed in February 1915, serving with the Argyll and Sutherlands. He now lies buried in Dickiebush Cemetery in Belgium, but is commemorated on a plaque in Muiravinside Church. Changing fortunes and death duties saw the Stirlings living in Muiravinside part-time, leasing the house out to paying tenants. In the Second World War, the house was requisitioned as an anti-aircraft regiment of the Polish forces. The building never quite recovered, and by the 1970s was in a bad state, as you can see from these before and after photographs. Today, there is not much left to show of a house with an interesting history, an information plaque next to the building outline, and a Stirling family graveyard hidden deep in the surrounding woods, from which I took another sad farewell. I thought to cheer myself up, I'd cycle to Abercorn Kirkyard, the burial ground which surrounds the fascinating 12th century church. The headstones are amazing and feature in many books on British grave carvings. Here are shown just a tiny sample, the death head symbol of mortality, the tools of trade of a gardener and a baker. I once featured with some pupils recording these headstones and many more in an episode of a children's TV program called Why Don't You Switch Off Your Television Set and Go and Do Something Less Boring Instead? A really catchy title, huh? Usually it was shortened to Why Don't You? And it was a really popular show in the 80s and 90s. Also at Abercorn is the mausoleum of the Hope family, and beneath the kirk itself, the last resting place of the Diels. Tam was laid to rest there in January 2017, having served for 21 years as Linlithgow MP. After a heavy period of rain, Tam once took me down into the Diel crypt. The floodwater had shifted lead coffins and some more open burials, and the place was a mess. I helped him interpret some Latin inscriptions and various coats of arms, and we made some sense of it. I was particularly fascinated to see the last resting place of General Tam Diel, the bloody Muscovite, who died in 1685, but still haunts the bins to this day. While I was at Abercorn, on my bike, I thought it would be sacrilege not to visit the nearby Midhope Castle. It was naturally shut due to the COVID crisis, but I managed to get close enough to see the familiar building. Familiar not because I'd ever been there before, but of course I'd seen it often in the Outlander series on television. Most recognisable was the front door, where Jamie Fraser, Laird of Lallybroch, as the castle is called in the TV series, is often seen entering or exiting the building. And it is only the exterior the film crew use, as the inside is derelict, a shell, but a fascinating one with an interesting history. Initially built in the 15th century by the Laird of Midhope, John Martin, but later acquired by a branch of the Drummonds. The head of that family was Alexander, a member of the King's College of Justice. He too lost a son in war, this time in the Battle of Grelle in the Netherlands, where William Drummond was fighting against Spain, yet another member of the Scots-Dutch Brigade. His death is commemorated, along with the whole battle, every 2 years, in a massive reenactment involving 350 uniformed Dutch enthusiasts. The Livingstons next acquired the keep, and it became an occasionally used boat hole for George Livingston, the 3rd Earl of Linlithgow, until he died in this very building in 1690. He was taken to Linlithgow and buried in the family mausoleum, which was formerly a solid stone construction seen to the right of the picture outside St Michael's Church. It was declared an eyesore and demolished in the late 18th century, but beneath it still lies, under the metal mortsafe and a stone entrance slab, the 3rd Earl. His earthly remains once disturbed by tomb robbers in 1980, but his skull replaced in the lead coffin and his tomb resealed. As you've already heard, the Livingstons fell into disgrace after the Jacobite rebellion, and the Hope family took possession of Midhope. John Hope, a wealthy merchant and entrepreneur, moved his family into Midhope while a more stately mansion was being built not far away, a building that later became Hopetoun House. Sadly, John Hope never lived to see his domestic vision. While accompanying the Duke of York, later King Charles II, on a journey from London to Leith, the ship they were travelling on, HMS Gloucester, struck a sandbank and sank. The Duke, later King Charles II, survived, as did John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, the hero of Blenheim, and an ancestor of Winston Churchill. Unfortunately, John Hope did not survive, but went down with the ship. His son and widow did move into Hopetoun House, a much more palatial building than Midhope, which was vacated and allowed to decay. By the 19th century, the building had been subdivided and was being used to house farm workers, and gradually the interior crumbled. A beautiful painted ceiling was salvaged and installed in the Abbey Strand tea room outside the gates to Holyrood Palace, but little else remains except the castle shell and the new popularity of the building, Lallybroch, visited annually by hundreds, mainly Americans, who avidly follow the seas based on the books written by Diana Gabaldon, a lady I met when she visited Linlithgow last year. And the Hopetoun estate knows it's on to a good thing. They have erected a custodian's office and charge parking fees. £5 for a car, £40 for a minibus, and £80 for a coach. But I paid nothing. I was on my bike. And there my journey ends, until I get on my trusty electric steed again. Why don't you try? Thank you.